Nintendo has had a fairly unique problem over its more than 35 years in the gaming industry, and it's one that only grows over time. I mean, most veteran game studios have a degree of this trouble, but Nintendo, in my opinion, is first and foremost here. Can you guess what it is? I'll give you a second. Yeah, exactly. Nintendo has created or acquired so many franchises that each have unique game mechanics, personalities, and fan bases that they cannot sustain all of them. Sure, Sega, Capcom, Sony, Konami, and plenty of others share this same pitfall, but Nintendo is the king of too many IPs to simultaneously manage. However, after some recent happenings and news, I think they found a sleek 3-step plan to be able to bring dormant franchises back to the limelight, and I'm excited to see it continue to play out. Let's talk about it. I think this idea of too many IP to handle is probably a given if you're invested in the Nintendo ecosystem, but let me provide just a bit of backup to that claim so I'm not making a whole video on seemingly false assumptions. So here's what I'm talking about. In a good year, Nintendo publishes between 10 and 15 first-party games, sometimes more, sometimes less. They also publish some third-party titles that aren't Nintendo-owned franchises, but are Nintendo-exclusive games oftentimes. For example, in 2019, Nintendo published Daemon X Machina outside of Japan, but only because it was an exclusive game, not because Nintendo owns the IP. It actually came to PC later down the road. On the other hand, in 2019, they also published Astral Chain, developed by Platinum Games. But this is a game that they had a closer hand in, and Nintendo actually now owns the IP, just like they do Bayonetta, also by Platinum Games. So this conversation doesn't really care about the Daemon X Machinas of the world, since Nintendo isn't planning when they'll make sequels or remakes with that IP, but rest assured that somewhere in Nintendo, they are asking the question, how long do we wait until the next Astral Chain? And this planning phase is what Nintendo seemingly does with every single franchise they own. And when I'm talking about this, I'm not just thinking Mario or Zelda or Panel de Pon, but literally game franchises like 2D Mario and Mario Golf and Mario Kart and Mario Strikers and Mario Party and Mario Artist, and Mario finally takes a sabbatical. With that 10 to 15 games a year, Nintendo publishes, let's assume 12 of them are ones Nintendo owns for simplicity. Then they want to spread them out so as not to crowd their own market, meaning let's say they'll put out one game a month. Now, the other factor, the sheer number of franchises Nintendo owns, active or otherwise. By my count, it's over 110. And some of these have only had one game, but that doesn't make even those fully forgettable. For example, Ice Climbers. Their one game is arguably not very good, but the significance of Ice Climbers in a post-Smash Bros. World is not negligible. But when Nintendo publishes an example 12 games per year, when will they fit in the time to resurrect something like Ice Climbers? You could say that in 10 years they just cycle through the whole list of IPs, and that's all of them. But we all know that lots of those slots are already accounted for by recurring franchises. Every year there's some kind of Zelda release. Then there's a new 3D Mario every 4 or 5 years, and a Fire Emblem every 3, and so on. And when you start to factor in every recurring franchise, it's easy to imagine that Nintendo studios have been pretty packed full for a while. But now here we are with the Switch. In the Wii U days especially, I wouldn't have blamed Nintendo for playing it safe and only releasing the titles they had the utmost confidence in, trying to turn the tides in their favor. And in those days, we even had a home console and a handheld for Nintendo to consider, but in their eyes, it certainly wasn't the time to waste production resources on small risks, like bringing back IP that were growing forgotten and aren't recognizable to the masses. But like I said, we're now in the Switch era. Objectively, the best poised Nintendo has ever been to do what I've wanted them to do since year 2 of the console: get weird. Take the risks and dive in the deep end by letting a whole team make a new F-Zero, or Mother Game, or 3D Battle Royale Panel de Pon. But despite their continued success, Nintendo has doubled down on moderately safe franchise choices so far. Mario, Yoshi, Kirby, Smash, Luigi's Mansion, Splatoon, Fire Emblem. Of course, the way they did some of these games were certainly risky, Breath of the Wild being the best example of a predictable franchise flipping the gameplay on its head. And hopefully we'll see more of the same down the road with a new take on Kirby or on Star Fox or the likes. but generally we're getting quality versions of predictable franchises until 2021. Finally, the lessons from the success of the early years are coming to fruition, because games are now getting announced and released that give me so much hope for the future of some of these dormant franchises. This was especially true after this last E3, where we saw Advanced Wars Reboot Camp and Metroid Dread, and earlier in the year with Famicom Detective Agency, and to a tangential extent new Pokemon Snap. These games are showing us the trajectory that Nintendo will very likely take to bring back these dormant IPs. Like I said in the introduction, this is a 3-step plan with only one franchise having taken that third step, a couple having taken the second, and a whole bunch more hanging out in the first step. That first step is literally just to be a dormant franchise. I know that seems like a no-brainer, but it's not that this is a foolproof plan that anyone can follow. I personally don't have any dormant gaming franchises laying around that I can resurrect, so it may be a step that Nintendo had to take years or decades ago, but it's one that they took. Examples of this are ones like I said, F-Zero, Mother, My Baby, Golden Sun, Diddy Kong Racing, and the list goes on. In physics terms, these all have tons of potential energy, but until development and publishing force is exerted onto them, they're just waiting for their time back in the limelight. The second step is, of course, where it starts to get interesting. Like we talked about before, Nintendo studios are generally busy with a bunch of their heavy hitters. Heck, even some of their strong franchises are made by third-party studios. Up until recently, Next Level Games, who made Luigi's Mansion 3, a game that sold more than 10 million units, was a third-party studio. HAL Laboratories, who makes Kirby, Grezzo, who makes the Zelda remakes, heck, even Sora Limited, Sakurai Studio, who makes Smash. These are affiliates of Nintendo's, but Nintendo doesn't actually own them. But Nintendo is relying on these affiliate studios, often called second-party studios, or even sometimes fully third-party studios like Koei Tecmo on the Hyrule Warriors games, to make staple games for Nintendo because Nintendo's internal teams are booked up. So if these studios are all busy, then if Nintendo did want to resurrect Excitebike, who would they get to do it? Well, the answer is obviously another third party. But there's a catch. With these second-party studios and established IPs, there are established brand bibles and rules for the franchises and things that Link can or can't do. But Pilot Wings? What's the established rule set for that? And that's where Nintendo is showing their hand. Like we see especially with Advanced Wars Reboot Camp, and previously saw with another game I'll get to in a second, they're asking these dev teams that they trust to modernize and remake a prior entry in the franchise first. Taking Reboot Camp and its developer WayForward as an example, this accomplishes several things. For one thing, it's just gotta be exciting anytime you're a studio that Nintendo asks you to work on one of their established IPs. That's just a given. It also gives WayForward, an experienced developer, but with less breadth of work than Nintendo, an opportunity to work on a game with Nintendo's specific game design philosophy, and experience with how the cogs turn in that IP, Advance Wars in this case. Furthermore, once the game is announced and released, it brings further attention to Advanced Wars here in 2021 ahead of any possible new titles. This means that if a new game were to come out, it's not only those of us who watch these kinds of videos and have heard of Sin and Punishment or something who know what Advanced Wars is. And lastly, it just adds another title to Nintendo's game lineup while buying them more time to double down on any big titles they've got in the works in their internal studios. Also, it's a pretty low-risk way to test a franchise in the modern day. That's why everyone was saying Famicom Detective Agency really needs to sell well, because it seems like this is our only chance to show Nintendo whether this title deserves to keep going or not. I mentioned that Nintendo already did all this, but before I get into that, I want to suggest that if you're not subscribed to this channel, that you go ahead and do so, because I'm going to make something like a part 2 to this video in the next couple of weeks, where we take the IPs that are stuck in step 1 and imagine how Nintendo could bring them through steps 2 and 3 and back into the modern gaming space, whether that be ones I already mentioned like F-Zero and Golden Sun, or other ones like Wario Land and 1080. So the prime example of this ideology has already made its way to step 3. It's 2D Metroid. The last 2D Metroid game had been Metroid Fusion on the Game Boy Advance, and then in 2017, Nintendo announced and released Samus Returns, a remake and reimagining of Metroid 2 from the Game Boy, developed by Mercury Steam but then released on the 3DS. This is exactly what we're talking about for step 2, by the way. Obviously, Nintendo was still involved as Yoshio Sakamoto was still the producer of the game, and the directors were Takahiko Hokusawa from Nintendo, but also Jose Luis Marquez of Mercury Steam. Ultimately, as described in the conversations about the game after the fact, this was internally an amazing collaboration, and it cost the resource of one Nintendo full-time employee, another one likely part-time, as the producer role is usually not as hands-on, and then also just the price of paying another studio to do the work. And this product was a perfect case where you won't find a single person reasonably tell you that the original was better than the remake. Its only downfall was coming out on the 3DS right after the Switch came out, so sales were still tenuous. But we're going to dive into that topic fully in a separate video in the next couple weeks, so like I said, go ahead and subscribe. And obviously that game either sold well enough for Nintendo to consider a success, or otherwise they understood its poor circumstances and saw the great quality of the game despite that, which led them to our famous Step 3 that I think we'll see more of down the road. Used a third party that modernized the old game to make a brand new game in the franchise. For Metroid, that is Metroid Dread. And probably to some degree, this third step is still somewhat in the testing phase for the franchise. For example, if Metroid Dread, as a brand new game that's being marketed well and at the right time and place and on a platform that has good sales, still sells objectively badly, then the experiment likely fails there. We don't know, but if not, then in the same way that third-party Next Level Games is officially the Luigi's Mansion developer, Mercury Steam could become the 2D Metroid developer, and WayForward becomes the Advance Wars developer, since Intelligent Systems is split between Fire Emblem, Paper Mario, and WarioWare. And Mages Inc. becomes the Famicom Detective Club developer, and Bandai Namco becomes the new Pokemon Snap developer, and so on. Again, we're going to make a video proposing a roadmap to success for a bunch of dormant Nintendo IPs sometime soon, so stick around for that. So it seems silly, and there's a chance we're wrong and this trend ends with these games exactly, but too many factors seem to line up to not suggest that Nintendo is trying to use as many outside resources as possible to find out what franchises they'll be able to resurrect during their time in the limelight. And I almost forgot to record this part, but it's kind of key part of this whole thing showing that this seems to be continuing going forward. This is from IGN. Forever Entertainment, the Polish publisher behind the Panzer Dragoon remake and Fear Effect Sedna, has announced it will be publishing several titles on the Nintendo Switch through a partnership with Nintendo. Continuing on, it says no specifics were about what games are included in this collaboration were given, nor who would develop them, but For Entertainment will receive significant financial support from Nintendo to publish the titles. IGN reached out to both Nintendo and Forever Entertainment for comment and confirmation on the news. Nintendo replied with a statement, Nintendo is supporting Forever Entertainment via a fund for Nintendo Switch game development. Forever Entertainment similarly confirms the partnership. So all that to say, it's entirely possible that this is more of the same kind of thing and that they'll be doing some kind of remake for Nintendo. I do have to wonder if it would turn out a little bit better than Panzer Dragoon Remake, which people didn't seem to like all that much, but Nintendo's supervision is probably a little bit more heavy-handed than some other third-party publishers would be. So fingers crossed that this is more of the same and, brings more IPs back to life. But that's what I think. What do you think? What's your perfect pair of third-party developers to modernize the which dormant Nintendo IP? Or do you think we're totally reaching here? Let me know all that and more in the comment section down below, and we'll pull a couple of those to talk about on our podcast this weekend. And while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe to fanatixfour for more content like this every Tuesday and Thursday from me and AJ, and the podcast every Saturday on our podcast channel directly to you, or podcast services and all that. All right, that's all I've got for today. See you around in the next videos. Peace and blessings.